We want to take maximum advantage of the time that we have. And it is my exceedingly great pleasure to welcome back to the law school, to the very room in which he took many classes, Tom West, who graduated from the law school in 1999 and has had an enviable and spectacular career as a tax lawyer. He has been in private practice. He has in both accounting firms and law firms. He has been in government at the Treasury Department more than once until last week. He was the Deputy Assistant Treasury Secretary for Tax Policy in the Office of Tax Policy at the Department of the Treasury, and the Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy is that is like the highest, best tax job that you can have in this country, probably even in the world. And he is the deputy to her, or he was the deputy to her. But in another tour of duty at Treasury, he also had the tax job that I think has the coolest acronym, because he was the Tax Legislative Council, which is the TLC.
No scrubs.
He's going to talk for about half an hour, and that will leave plenty of time for questions from the audience. And so welcome back, Tom, and we look forward to hearing what you're going to talk about based on your experiences at Treasury and in practice and your love and devotion to the tax system.
Thanks so much, Alice. This is such an amazing turnout. Thank you all. I'm talking about tax and you want to hear it. I'm not used to necessarily finding such a receptive audience for tax lawyers, but the Temple has always been special in many senses. So I'm glad to see the front rows are still relatively empty. Some things don't change. Hey, thank you, Alice, for the invitation. I'm so flattered, humbled to be able to come back here to Temple. It's really not an exaggeration to say, like, I owe it all to Temple Law. I had my first tax classes here. My degree, I took my degree and have had this really interesting and rewarding career. I think I've had great jobs. And I probably should have led with this. I met my wife in my 1L section here. So also kind of a big deal. We just celebrated our 20th wedding anniversary. So so you may be with many of these people for a long time. Although I will say, I was talking to my 11-year-old son last night. He said, "What are you doing tomorrow?" I said, "Oh, I'm going back to Temple. Why do they want to hear from you?" Is what he said. He's like, "Well, I'm an alumnus and it's pretty cool." He said, "You're not like Hassan Reddick." So I guess in levels of Temple alumni, to be clear, I am not Hassan Reddick. But I do feel like maybe I have some wisdom to impart. In terms of my post-Temple life, I've had the great privilege to have basically a front row seat for the last 10 years of key developments in the federal kind of tax policy and in the tax system. And I want to spend a little bit of time today talking about those, and maybe more importantly, what the past developments can kind of tell us about what our priorities are in terms of tax policy and other policies in this country, and then what kind of some of the recent developments might portend for where we're going. So I'm excited. Just a real quick, Alice touched on this, a real quick timeline on me and my time at Treasury, and there's one important part of it. So I started at Treasury in 2014 in the Obama administration. I was a career person, and I had the cool TLC job at the time, but to be clear, career, not political. So that means you carry over. You don't leave when the administration changes if you're a career hire. So that meant, on January 21st, 2017, all of the political people And that was everybody above me cleared out. And I found myself as the highest ranking tax person in the Trump Treasury administration. To be clear, I was not a political appointee in that administration. And I'm not assuming anyone's feelings about that administration versus others, but I always like to make it clear. So I was there and I spent 2 years working very, in a very senior capacity for Secretary Mnuchin at the time, very consequential time. The 2017 tax reform went through while I was there at that time. I left in 2018 because it was all getting to be a little much, frankly, in that administration. But I was very lucky during the transition when President Biden was elected. I got the call to come back, and I started with the Biden administration basically from day one as a political appointee this time. And that's the job I've had for the last few years, which again, super consequential time in terms of tax law and tax developments. And yeah, I just left that job last Thursday. It was bittersweet, but time to move on. And now I can kind of tell you the real scoop too, because I'm unemployed. So let me start back to tax policy and some of the things I want to talk about today. So maybe at some point, tax policy was a relatively discrete matter, and you could cabin in tax policy a little bit. But even if that was true, if that was ever true, I maintain that at this point, it's almost impossible to distinguish, what we think of as tax policy from just policy, certainly from domestic policy writ large. And as tax lawyers, or at least hopefully tax curious lawyers, I think it's an exciting and challenging time to be engaging with the tax system. Now, to be clear, tax policy has always been about more than tax. Let's not kid ourselves about that. We all know that. You see that even before you take your first tax class. I suspect many of you see, some tax policy choices that we collectively make. You might not be aware before, your 1L tax class about things like the marriage penalty or huge preferences for homeowners in the tax system over renters. And, those are big, right? Those are big policy choices we collectively have chosen to make. And maybe those aren't as obvious to a layperson, but many of us are familiar with something like, let's say, excise taxes on products or behaviors that we at various times as a society or as a government have judged to be detrimental or problematic. So I'm thinking about things like, they call them sin taxes on alcohol or tobacco, that big tax policy right in there. There's also lots of tax policy wrapped up in something as, I hesitate to say simple, but as simple as sales tax, right? State and localities exempt certain things from sales tax, right? We all know that. They exempt certain staples like most groceries or prescription medications. But even within that category, there are decisions that are made that, we could spend an entire hour or days on that discussion. I mean, one example, a choice that we make in at least as of last year, I think there were about 21 states where they still impose sales tax on menstrual products. That seems like a pretty big policy call, right? A lot of equities or inequities there. So again, let's not pretend, and I'm not pretending, that tax and tax policy can ever or has ever truly been distinguished from other kinds of policy. But that's not, those examples are not really what my remarks are about today. But I just want to be clear and acknowledge that, we've always used the tax code to incentivize or discourage certain things. So are we doing that more now? I don't know. When I was thinking about sin taxes, just one quick digression here that I promised ties back in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that legislation passed, there was something called opportunity zones that were enacted for the first time. I don't know if any of you have encountered those. Those were incentives to make investments in lower income census tracts, places that had been, historically underinvested, underserved. I think there was a lot of good intention behind those programs, or behind the idea for those programs. I think for a variety of reasons, it hasn't really translated to the kinds of benefits that some of its champions would have liked to see. But regardless, opportunity zones, that's what opportunity zones were. And after 2017, in my office, we were implementing this, writing the regulations, and the opportunity zones had this list of sin businesses that were not eligible for opportunity zone investment. And they pulled this category of sin businesses from a really, I don't know, circa 1980 cross-reference to an old part of the code. So we started looking, and it's not enumerated when you look at the TCJA language, but you go and you look at this cross-reference, and one of the things stands out. So it was like golf courses, sure, country clubs, liquor stores, okay, suntan facilities, okay, sin business in their mind. And then hot tub facilities. You weren't allowed to invest in hot tub facilities. I don't know, hopefully nobody here is terribly familiar. Maybe you are with hot tub facilities. We were not. And I went down this rabbit hole. It's like, what the hell are they talking about? And of course, like anything crazy, it can be traced to Florida. Florida had in the early 80s these hot tub facilities, apparently. And anyway, that is the danger and interesting thing that can happen when you're drafting legislation and you go and you pull from a place and you don't necessarily know what was back there in all instances. So that's going to come up again as a theme. But I was thinking about the list of sin businesses, and yeah, I'll get back to some of those points. No more hot tub anecdotes, unless it comes up in the Q&A, I guess. But let me move on. So I'd like to talk about tax policy using, the classic law school three-prong approach. I think it was actually Professor Raddert's constitutional law class here where I first learned or encountered prongs and the Platonic ideal of three prongs. So in honor of that, let's use the classic constitutional three prongs, legislative, executive, and judicial branches, and talk about developments in each of those areas in the world of tax policy, how they interact, and what they might tell us about where we're going. So let's start with the legislative branch. Now, I appreciate that so many of you have opted to be here for a deep discussion of tax policy. And hopefully, given that kind of audience, you will also appreciate me getting a little bit weedy in principles of congressional parliamentary procedure, if you guys can come along with me. But I know you're very lucky to be here. You could have had Hassan Reddick. So I don't think a discussion of kind of modern US tax policy can be had without some understanding of the current legislative process. And in that landscape, virtually all of the major tax legislation that we've seen enacted going back at least to George W. Bush has been passed through the reconciliation process. I think some of you are probably familiar with what reconciliation bills are, but I don't know if everybody appreciates tax cuts under George Bush in 2001 and 2003 were both passed through reconciliation. The Affordable Care Act in 2010 under President Obama passed through reconciliation. Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed through reconciliation. The American Rescue Plan in 2021 and the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022 under President Biden. All of those huge, huge pieces of legislation, really significant tax legislation, all of those passed through reconciliation. Why? Why are we using, or why is Congress using reconciliation? Well, they have when Congress is composed of slim majorities in the Senate. The respective parties can't get 60 votes, which is, I don't know if you can say normal about anything with Congress, especially these days, but under normal procedures, right? 60 votes is the filibuster-proof majority that you would need to pass legislation through normal rules. So you end up using reconciliation. I don't have the time or really the expertise probably to really unpack everything that goes into reconciliation or what it means to pass something by reconciliation. But suffice to say that it imposes significant restrictions on what the legislation can do and what areas that Congress can actually touch within the broader kind of US code. Social Security, can't do anything with Social Security in a reconciliation bill. Generally speaking, Congress doesn't touch discretionary spending in a reconciliation bill. It really has to be limited to spending and revenue and the budget deficit, or the debt limit, I should say. So we can't use reconciliation bills to do kind of more everyday policy things. The Biden administration in 2021 tried to use the reconciliation bill that became the American Rescue Plan. We had in there something to raise the federal minimum wage. That was ruled by the parliamentarian to be, not eligible for a reconciliation bill. So we couldn't do it that way. So again, important policy considerations you can't do. It also, importantly, reconciliation bills can't raise the budget deficit outside of the 10-year window past which they are enacted. So that's why in things like the 2001 tax cuts, in the 2017 tax cuts, we see all these weird sunsets on tax provisions. All of those things are because outside of that 10-year window, if you didn't sunset those provisions, you would have huge increases in the deficit. And under reconciliation, that's not allowed. And again, not subject to filibuster. If you do something through reconciliation. So that, it's really the legislation of last resort, but in recent years, it's been the only legislation that Congress has been able to do significant things through. So what does that mean for tax policy, right? Well, first of all, it means that a lot of policy priorities that might be advanced through different means in a different situation are achievable only by using tax incentives. You want to address child poverty as a policy matter. Well, now you do that through the tax code, through the child tax credit. Not the only way, but that's a significant way that it's done. You want to address the climate crisis. Okay, well, that's done through the tax code too. The Inflation Reduction Act passed in 2022 is the biggest investment, is cited the biggest investment in green energy and fighting climate change in the history of the world, right? Hundreds of billions of dollars of tax credits are really what are what are in the Inflation Reduction Act. It contains tax incentives for buying electric vehicles, investing in wind and solar energy facilities, clean hydrogen, charging infrastructure, dozens of other programs. None of that is traditional tax policy, right? How about employment concerns and pro-worker concerns? If you have a pro-worker policy preference, how do you do that? Again, we're doing it now through the tax code. The Inflation Reduction Act contains these provisions called prevailing wage and apprenticeship rules that say that if you're a developer who wants to get one of those tax credits to build your big hydrogen facility or to build your wind facility, you have to pay all of your workers good wages, and you have to employ apprentices while you're building these facilities. That's really novel. I'm telling you, as somebody who's trying to write the rules to implement that, that is not something that we have ever done through the tax code, but we couldn't figure out other ways to do it. And what the president said and what the administration said and what Congress said is, if we're going to spend this money, invest this money to decarbonize the economy, we should be including incentives for good jobs in there and incentives for apprentices so that while we're doing this work, we're also building a future workforce. So that's great, in my opinion, that's great. That's the intent behind it. But again, all of that running through the tax code now. It's kind of wild to think about. How about industrial policy and trade policy? Those are all also advanced through the tax code. Most recently, you had the Infrastructure Investment Act and the CHIPS Act. Again, both pieces of legislation in 2022 passed, those two on a bipartisan basis. But these have billions of dollars in incentives for high-tech manufacturers who want to locate their facilities in the United States. So this is about bringing basically advanced chip manufacturing back onshore to the United States. As a result of that legislation in 2022, there have been hundreds of billions of dollars of projects announced by private sector actors who are building these facilities in the United States for the first time in a long time. I think you get the picture. There's a lot of these things. There's a lot of policy things going through the tax code now. It's not just talking about corporate tax rates and how we treat capital gains. You know, a lot more. Those are the traditional ideas, but all of these other things are in the tax legislation bucket these days. Excuse me 1 second. I think the other thing to recognize about a legislative process that relies on reconciliation to pass these laws is that your margins in the Senate are so narrow. It often comes down to literally one vote at this point. I mean, there's the famous, John McCain thumbs down vote that you all remember. That was a reconciliation bill where the Republicans were trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act, and it failed, ended up failing by 2 votes. But McCain was, that vote was why it was so critical. They needed every single vote to get that passed, and because they didn't, they lost by that vote. We still have the Affordable Care Act, which is pretty amazing. But every senator becomes a kingmaker when you're talking about margins that are that slim, right? One single senator, I can tell you, when the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, one senator was really adamant that the rate on the 199A deduction for pass-through entities should be moved. It started at 17% all through the process, and at the very last minute, he pushed it and it went up to 20%. Now, 20% from 17% on a deduction, think about the billions of dollars that has translated to in the years since then. It's kind of remarkable. And again, it was one person kind of just dug in his heels and said, this is what I want, and I'm not voting unless it goes my way. Same thing happened on the Inflation Reduction Act. I can tell you that there was all kinds of horse trading at the last minute. The corporate alternative minimum tax, huge carve-outs happening to the corporate alternative minimum tax the very last hour. So much revenue fell off the table that the Congress actually had to add in the stock excise buybacks tax. That hadn't been in there for a long time. And this huge new policy, wholesale, was put in there just to make up for revenue on a carve out from the corporate alternative minimum tax in almost literally the hours before passage. So yeah, I could tell you stories. I will. I say, Professor Brave said, I'll do the war stories in the Q&A session. So why is all of that interesting beyond kind of the inside baseball nature of it? Well, for those not familiar with the process, you might think that negotiations and drafting of legislation is all very deliberative and considered. Well, maybe people don't have that high a view of Congress these days, but I mean, I certainly always thought that, that's how things went down. But when you see it up close, it can be truly shocking. I think as law students, we're taught about statutory interpretation and the importance of parsing the legislative history of a statute and the wisdom that can be gleaned by interrogating the intent of the drafters. And listen, I'm not saying that that's not true sometimes, but in my recent experience, I can tell you that there is a lot of careful work and deliberation that often goes into an initial draft. But by the time you get to the end, by the time that vote is happening, especially in a reconciliation process, all of that careful work is just laid to waste. Segueing to our next prong, I guess my last thought is I've been in a lot of these legislative drafting sessions as a representative of the executive branch at Treasury. And what I always, the heartbreaker was you talking to the Senate staff and they're drafting and they can't quite figure it out. And they say, this is too hard. We'll just give Treasury authority to deal with it in the regulations. I was just like, oh, so it's going to be my problem now. So that is the stage in the process where I'm going to say my office, even though, as I said, I left, but I'm still there in my heart, in my head. So Treasury, on behalf of the administration, is responsible for, issuing regulations, tax regulations, and guidance to implement legislation. I've noted in recent years, it's been a lot more than just tax that Treasury has been tasked to work on. Again, my office was responsible for standing up large parts of the Affordable Care Act. So we had to become healthcare experts when we were doing that. Later, we had responsibility to help stand up a program where we did advanced child tax credit payments in 2021 for the first time. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but that was a logistical problem. That was a strategic problem, lots of policy, but not really anything that you would call tax or tax law. But again, the responsibility of our office. Treasury is now in the midst of implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. All of the green energy tax provisions I've been talking about, that they involve questions about what constitutes steel, what is a free trade agreement, when is something sufficiently domestic as to be domestic content, the makeup of lithium batteries and the critical minerals that go into those batteries. Tax credits depend on those questions now. And so folks in my office, tax lawyers, working with others across the administration, these are all questions that the Office of Tax Policy is having to answer in regulations. It's a lot, I can tell you. But rather than continue to dwell on the idea that there's more to tax work these days than just tax, I think you all appreciate that. I'd like to talk about how policy decisions play out in the context of Treasury and its regulatory function. As I said a moment ago, Congress, I feel like, especially in recent years, has been delegating more authority to Treasury and the IRS to figure out the details. It's obviously always been the case that you need regulations to fill in the details after a statute is passed. But it's also the case that as more laws, I think, have been passed through reconciliation, there's more ambiguity. And when the process is so ad hoc and last minute, you're going to end up with issues in the legislation that, and there's no legislative history, which importantly, in many of the recent reconciliation bills, there's been no official legislative history. So that leaves the folks at Treasury who are trying to write regulations in a real bind sometimes. So let me talk about two recent examples of administrative action to implement tax legislation and talk to you about how the policy choices were made there. First off, I'm going to go back to my old Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, Section 199A example. I mentioned 199A a moment ago. This is the 20% deduction that's available based on pass-through businesses' qualified income. We could spend the day talking about 199A. To be clear, I know that this is a favorite of law professors because it is a truly confounding mix of incentives and dubious policy choices. I will tell you, I had the pleasure of supervising the drafting of the regulations under Section 199A. Shortly after they came out, I left my position at Treasury for the first time. Total coincidence. Anyway, let's focus on, again, there's so much in the statute, but let's focus on one piece of the statute and regulations, and that is the ineligibility of certain kinds of businesses for the 199A deduction. There are businesses that the statute describes as specified service trades or businesses, SSTBs. I'm really going to try and avoid acronyms, but as a tax practitioner for many years, it's very hard for me. So I'm going to talk about SSTBs. And when you think about them, think about two things. First of all, you don't have to worry if you're one of these ineligible businesses as long as you're below relatively high income thresholds. So we're only talking about these businesses that I think this year it's about $380,000 for a married filer before you have to worry about this ineligibility or this limitation that's imposed. So again, high-end businesses, relatively speaking. But the statute says that these businesses, these specified service trade or businesses, are not eligible for the 199A deduction. And it defines those businesses, I'm going to abbreviate the list, as those performing services in the fields of health, law, accounting, actuarial science, consulting, financial services, brokerage services. There's a few others, but that is what it says in the statute. And the statute actually pulls that list from an old statute, from section 1202, except it explicitly carves out two kinds of businesses that are listed in the old 1202 statute. It carves out architecture firms and engineering firms. So it basically says that architecture and engineering firms, you have no restrictions on you. You are not an SSTB, even though you're in this old list. All of those other kinds of businesses, health, law, actuarial, accounting, brokers, you are on this bad list, this naughty list, and you are not entitled to this deduction. Why did architects and engineers get carved out? No one knows. Well, a few people know. I know a bunch of lobbyists who know, and I actually think I know. I'll tell you when it's not being recorded later. But it makes no sense, right? It makes no sense. But there's a lot of big policy calls wrapped up in the legislation, is my point, before you even get to the regulations. Is there any policy reason why a local CPA office that has 20 employees is not eligible for this deduction, but a hair salon or a landscaping business down the street with 20 employees is eligible? I don't know. They're employing people, they're in the community. It doesn't seem like a terribly logical or defensible policy choice, but Congress made that choice. Okay. And why architects and engineers? They're eligible, but actuaries are not. Again, Congress made that call. Treasury, honestly does not get to question those calls, and we generally don't. But we do have to put, when that provision comes to us, we do have to put some detail around the other businesses that are enumerated, the health, law, and such. So health, we looked at the health businesses. That includes doctors and nurses, seems obvious. Veterinarians, okay, they're in. They are in the business of health. That's what we decided at the time. They were a little bit surprised, but health club operators, not in. Okay. Those decisions were all made by a team of tax lawyers, right? Trying to parse the statute and come to a logical decision. Not inherently anything taxy about this, but that's the job. I think the most interesting of the calls that was made with respect to specified services is the one about brokerage services. When you initially hear that term, it sounds a little antiquated, right? But there's a relatively straightforward meaning of broker in the kind of the common law. A person who facilitates transactions between buyers and sellers, usually standing between them for a fee. Well, that seems like it would include real estate brokers, right? And real estate agents, they stand between buyers and sellers, collect a fee. Insurance brokers, again, stand between an insurance company and a buyer, collect a fee. They're called brokers, right? You would think they would be in. But when the regulations came out, broker was defined as only being essentially a stockbroker. How did Treasury come to that decision? Well, those deliberations are not open to the public, so we can only speculate. But I mean, it could be that the tax lawyers stared at that and decided that the definition of broker in the regulations for some reason should only be stockbroker, even though that's somewhat nonsensical. Or it could be that the Treasury Secretary came into the meeting and said, it's August of 2018, a heated election season. There's lots of real estate agents and insurance brokers who we have as voters and donors to our party, and we want to throw them a bone and be able to talk about it. And there's lots of members of Congress and or their spouses who are registered real estate brokers. So let's just give them the benefit. I mean, it could happen that way. I'm not saying it did, but it could have happened that way. So sometimes the way policy happens, especially in the regulatory process, is a little bit mysterious. So that was a depressing example, at least for me, but, or maybe there's some well-off real estate agents in the room. You're welcome. But there are times when Treasury gets to flex its administrative powers in really cool and impactful ways. I'm going to talk about, I think, my favorite. I mentioned the American Rescue Plan and the child tax credit earlier. The American Rescue Plan expanded and enhanced the existing child tax credit. It had been $2,000 per child. The ARP increased it to $3,600 for kids under 6 and $3,000 for kids under 18. It also crucially made the CTC fully refundable, which meant that families, even if you didn't have tax liability above the amount of the credit, you could get the full amount of the credit. This was a huge change. It also provided that for the first time, half of the credit would actually be paid in advance to eligible families. So this happened in 2021, and it basically said, families, you don't have to wait until 2022 when you file your return to collect this $3,000 or $3,600 per child. The IRS is actually going to pay you, starting in July, in advance, half of the credit. So that was awesome, at least in theory. That legislation passed in March of 2021, and March 11th, I think, and Treasury and the IRS were then on the hook for starting this advanced payment program starting in July. And nothing like this had ever been done before. There were truly an untold number of policy choices that went into implementation. First of all, the statute called for periodic payments to taxpayers in advance. What does periodic mean? I don't know. We hadn't done it before. So people in the IRS said, well, we'll just do one payment. That's a periodic payment. We'll pay half of it sometime in the fall up front, and then half. Treasury said, no, let's make monthly payments. Let's try and do this right. And so while it would have been logistically easier to not do that, Treasury advocated to do monthly payments. That wasn't a foregone conclusion that it was going to happen that way. But we thought that it would help families supplement their budget and their bills if you got a monthly payment, right? That just makes sense. Once we kind of decided it was going to be a monthly payment, it was also a policy call as to when during the month the payment should go out, right? Nothing says, beginning of month, end of month. We decided on the middle of the month because in looking at the profile of a lot of households, especially those who rely on different kinds of government assistance, a lot of that comes either at the beginning or end of the month. And we thought that by putting this new payment in the middle of the month, it would help families bridge to the end of the month. So they didn't have to go to, get advanced loans against payroll loans, those kinds of things. That was a really cool policy choice that we thought of there. Can you imagine how much $250 or $300 in the middle of the month? It can be a real lifeline for families. So again, are we talking about tax policy? Yes. Are we talking about anything that you necessarily can have expertise learning in the classroom? I don't know, but it's really cool that we got to do that. I could spend hours really just talking about the CTC. There was one last thing, I guess, that was really cool. The statute didn't define who would get these payments. It just said, pay this out to people who you think might be eligible next year. That was really hard. But some of my colleagues in the Office of Tax Analysis, the economists in our office, stumbled onto this happy accident where we had identified this whole cohort of about 730,000 people who got stimulus payments the year before, who hadn't appeared on the tax register before. These are people who didn't file tax returns because if the CTC is not refundable, they weren't going to get any money. They didn't have any tax liability, so they weren't filing tax returns. But we looked at that cohort and we said, those people are going to be eligible for a fully refundable CTC. So even though they haven't filed tax returns in 2020, we're going to send them a payment. And so we sent hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars to these people over the course of 2021, just by kind of, I don't know, it was a policy call. We flexed our administrative authority to do that. Really cool. If you haven't read about the child tax credit, the advanced payment program, you really should. The Census Bureau talked about how it reduced in 2021 child poverty in this country to its lowest level ever. it was really a success story. It's something the government doing something right, executing it well. Congress unfortunately allowed that program to lapse. But I will say we have proof of concept now. We did it and we did it right. And I think there's a lot of people who are pushing to not only bring it back, but make it permanent. So that's really cool. Very quickly, on that happier note, I'll turn to the judiciary and its, involvement in tax policy. I suspect many of you are probably more well-versed than I on some of the developments. I was tracking the Moore case, obviously, because it was existential to the tax system. And I was telling some of you earlier when we talked that it was very cool. We got to go and kind of brief and help the Solicitor General get ready for that argument. And that was a cool experience. And I think, most people seem to think we're going to get a relatively good result coming out of Moore, although with the courts and these days, I don't count on anything. But even if we get a good result more, of course, everybody's, tracking the Loper Bright Chevron attack coming right behind it. I don't know if Chevron goes down. I don't know that tax regulations are going to be the first to be attacked or come under scrutiny. But I do know that it will create uncertainty in the tax system, right? And in my experience, uncertainty is a benefit to the well-funded, the well-advised. They can use uncertainty against the IRS. And then, the average small business person, the average individual, uncertainty is just bad for them. So that's going to be an unfortunate result if that comes to pass. And again, I worry, I noted earlier, in a post-Chevron world, Congress is out of the habit of legislating or legislating well. And so we've had Treasury and the IRS to backstop the places where Congress has been ambiguous using reconciliation bills. But if, Treasury's regulatory authority is curtailed, what does that mean? Does that mean the judges and the courts are going to fill in complicated tax questions about, the steel components in a wind tower and whether or not they qualify for a tax credit, or, the treatment of book income of derivative mark-to-market transactions for corporate alternative minimum tax purposes? I mean, trust me, I know a lot of regulators would like to push those questions off to others, but I don't think, courts are in any position to really answer those questions in systemic ways that'll be helpful. So, yeah, so I worry about that. I really don't want to end on kind of a down note. I think I gave the title this talk for tax policy for better and worse, and I felt like I've dwelt on some of the challenges facing the system and the regulators, but I don't want to lose sight of the fact that many of the challenges that I'm talking about are in service of new and very consequential developments, right? These are things where we're trying to tackle child poverty and we're trying to tackle the environmental crisis with the tools that we have, right? Through the tax code. So, so that's not a bad thing. And, when you think about reconciliation legislation and how it's not, maybe ideal and how that carries through, let's remember, let's think about the Affordable Care Act. As I said, the Affordable Care Act passed through reconciliation. The Affordable Care Act has been attacked nonstop by the legislature, by the legislative branch, by the judiciary so many times, but it stood up, right? Because you had the executive branch, you had President Biden and President Obama and the people who work for them shoring up the Affordable Care Act with regulations and guidance. It's survived, it's thrived. I don't know if you saw the statistics. As of last month, we had record signups for ACA marketplace coverage. Over 21 million people signed up for coverage through the ACA. That is huge. That is a success story. And a lot of that is because of tax policy. So I'm not discouraged. I am sometimes worried, but I'm never cynical about this stuff. So I think there's a lot of exciting stuff happening. And I think, engagement is the right way to go. So thanks so much. Really happy to take questions, constructive criticism. limericks. Thank you.
Questions, he really needs it.
I really do. Yeah. Please. Yeah.
So in the Inflation Reduction Act, there was a large amount of additional funding for the IRS. Since then, Republicans have been trying to pull that back in the name of reducing inflation.
Yeah.
Is there any way other than political posturing that it reduces the budget funding for the IRS?
No, I mean, it's funny, we were talking earlier. I think there's a paper some former colleagues of mine are going to put out in tax notes. It may be out already. I haven't been paying attention since I left my job last week, but I think it really, in a very thorough way, backs up the argument that there's a huge return on investment for money that you give to the IRS. I don't know if it's 4-to-1. Some of our economists at Treasury would tell you that it's 8-to-1 when you invest in the IRS. I mean, if we're not going to legislate, if we can't do legislation well, again, something we talked about, some of us earlier, we should enforce the laws we have on the books. And as the IRS has been hollowed out systematically in terms of funding, in terms of IT, they haven't been able to do that. And that's not really on them. They just haven't had the resources. But if you want to raise revenue without, having politicians who don't want to vote for quote unquote tax increases, then the way to do it is to fund the IRS. And yes.
I was impressed by your discussion about the reconciliation process. How it being sort of the only option we have to as it's forced Congress to enact policies through the tax system. But I want your reaction to the idea that I was always under the impression that even if they had other options, there's an incentive to do things through the tax system because, if you want to incentivize, let's say, environmental policy, it's harder to pass a bill that says we're going to write a check to businesses, in the field versus giving them some kind of hidden subsidy through the tax system. That was always my answer. So even if reconciliation were not the only avenue, wouldn't a lot of things still go through the tax system?
Yeah, listen, I think that's a great point. I immediately thought of the low-income housing tax credit when you started talking, right? We have a huge housing crisis in this country, right? Is the most efficient way to deliver affordable housing to people to have this arcane, elaborate tax credit that goes through developers and to each state's housing authority to allocate certain amount? I mean, it's crazy, and the transaction costs associated with low income tax credits are just ridiculous. So why can't we just kind of cut a check to either the people who are renting the units or the people who are building the units? You're right, because there's policy, there's a lot of people, I think, mostly on the Republican side, although LIHTC has bipartisan support. I think if you turned it into just a straight grant program, yeah, people aren't going to vote for it. You're absolutely right. Yes.
You mentioned earlier kind of disappointing results from the Opportunity Zone project. How do you think about place-based economic anti-poverty tax programs as opposed to person-based anti-poverty economic development, like the child tax credit?
Yeah, listen, it's a great question. It's not a particular policy angle I've gone deep on. I can tell you, like LIHTC, I spent a lot of time, both when I was at the government trying to stand up the Opportunity Zone program, and then when I was in private practice trying to help people who are trying to do it. It's really hard. I don't know if we have many great examples. We've tried empowerment zones, go zones. There have been many place-based attempts through the tax code in the past. I don't think any of them have delivered in a way that people hoped or expected. Again, I think there was a lot of good intention behind Opportunity Zones, but I also think there's some people who, well, the history there is really interesting. There were some people who said, we don't know anything about tax, and we're coming up with this program, and that they thought that was a feature. Turned out it was a little bit of a bug. So. Yes.
So when it comes to the Treasury making this kind of tax policy, what kind of role does the IRS and working with them play as well, since you have this kind of bifurcated
Yeah, it's a great question. So the IRS does not get involved in policy per se, but anything that touches on tax administration is kind of in their bucket. So when I was talking about the child tax credit, obviously they're the ones kind of cutting the checks, pushing them out. But we at Treasury got in because of the different things I was talking about. It's not, all of those things are policy calls, and you could keep pressing and say, when does it stop being a policy call? But as long as we felt like we were kind of helping them help themselves, I felt like, and we got along, the people, there's so many great people at the IRS. Obviously, the IRS is used as a punching bag and a boogeyman, but I can tell you, a lot of the IRS people are trying to make the system work and doing it, while hamstrung in terms of resources and that kind of thing. Like anywhere else, there's some people in the IRS who can be overly aggressive, but I think by and large, they're trying to do the right thing. Yes. Yeah.
Can you describe some of your best learning experiences while working for the IRS, and then also some of the ways that you passed on those learning experiences to younger lawyers?
Yeah, wow. I will say that I was in private practice for 14 or 15 years before I went to Treasury for the first time. And despite the fact that, I had been working in the tax world, I'd been living in Washington for much of that time. I knew people who worked in the government. There's an opacity to how the rules are made. And part of that is the fact that, I'm talking about the Office of Tax Policy. They sound monolithic because they're working on all this stuff. There were 50 lawyers. We had 50 lawyers in my office, and we had economists too, but that's the number of people who are really leading these efforts. So as much as anything, I love to, it was demystified for me once I got on the inside and saw, oh my gosh, these are just really smart tax lawyers trying to do the right thing. And you sometimes think there's hidden agenda or something like that on the part of the people who are making the regulations. But it's really not. Like I said about the IRS, there's a lot of people just trying to make the system work as best they can, usually dealing with, clunky statutes or difficult questions. And so that the biggest learning experience for me was really just to see it on the other side. And it's very hard. Like, I love talking to people and crowds and saying, like, it's not an ivory tower situation. It can seem that way, but Treasury is out there in the world. We go through notice and comment process on all of our regulations. And, we solicit comments from everyone, everywhere we go, and we read them all. Like, I got 25,000 comments on the digital asset reporting regulations that we put out last year. Some of them were real cranky. Crypto bros, not happy. But someone in our office is reading all of those, not any one individual. We have teams when we have something like that, but it really is a process where anyone can have input. And I often, in Washington in particular, I run into people or I hear people say, well, I can get you a meeting with Treasury. Like, they're selling their client on something. I was like, anybody can get it. Like, we have an open door policy. If you called and said, I'd like to come in and talk to you, I have ideas about these regulations, you could come in and talk to people at Treasury. So as much as anything, I think it's like knowing who to ask, or just knowing that this is accessible, the tax system. At least certainly under the Obama administration and the Biden administration, that was the case that I saw. How I've tried to pass that on, I don't know. I am an evangelist for the Office of Tax Policy, for people working in government. You can do short tenures, you can do long tenures, you can make it your life, but it is really the most interesting place as a lawyer that I've gotten to work. I have lots of friends around town. My wife has worked at DOJ for 20 years and will never leave. She's just loved it. And there's just really cool jobs out there. So that is what I tell people. Sure. Yes.
What is your favorite and least favorite code section?
My least favorite code section is probably section 355, the spinoff, the corporate spinoff provisions. I feel like it's the last way corporations can kind of get money out without, without tax at the corporate level. And this whole industry, this corporate bar has developed around 355, where over the years they felt like they have like their own window at the IRS where they can walk up and get their private letter rulings. And if you try and regulate in their space at all, you don't understand. I don't know. They're just the worst. Rich corporate lawyers telling us to back off. That's my least favorite. My favorite, oh my gosh. I don't know if I have a favorite. Let me think about that. There are other questions I can answer. Yes, sir.
Sorry if this is silly, but I'm just trying to understand the interplay between like the judiciary and then the role of the treasury. So in specific reference to USD Moore, right, where hypothetically the government's point of view maybe that a wealth tax could be posed as an excise tax on like privilege to conduct foreign business, et cetera. Like, how does that work then after that judicial opinion in terms of the treasury? Like, do you guys depend then on legislation to motivate like a task force, or is that something that then sets the treasury and IRS into a whole like free fall of then trying to redetermine things or redefine things?
Yeah, no, it's not a silly question at all. I mean, I mean, in the most extreme example, I don't know what we would do if Moore came down and said, invalidated subchapter K of the code. Like, I don't know how we'd handle that. If somehow they just say 965 is invalid, I don't know what we're going to do there either, except, give a couple $100 billion back to a bunch of corporations who have already paid it. I think I can talk about like an example, a different kind of example. Like there was a case last year where for years Treasury and the IRS had done reportable transactions, had this reportable transaction regime, and we would make transactions reportable using sub-regulatory guides. We would not put it out in regulations because we thought we had authority. I still think we have authority. Anyway, court invalidated our technique of using sub-regulatory guidance. They said that that should go through APA notice and comment if you're going to make a transaction, a reportable transaction. So suddenly we had all, 20 or 30 pieces of guidance that we had put out that the IRS is using in current litigation that are essentially invalid. So we kind of quickly had to decide what to do there. And with a bunch of those that we felt were important, things like conservation easements and micro captive insurance companies, we decided to regify the guidance we had. So we'll say, okay, you said it's invalid because we didn't go through notice and comment. We will do proposed regulations, take notice and comment, and hopefully finalize. So, that's cumbersome. That takes time. I mean, to go from 0 to getting a final regulation, I mean, usually that's about 18 months. So it's a significant undertaking. But yeah, in terms of plotting how we might respond to different outcomes in court cases, like I said, it's really hard. Like there's enough on the plate without like the hypothetical things coming. And to be clear, it's not a silly question. It's just like, I don't know. I don't know what the hell this Supreme Court is going to do, right? Like, so.
Well, did you have
Yeah.
a question? Sure. Maybe it's a good one today. This is a great sales pitch for being a government lawyer. There are a lot of 1Ls in this room, and also 2Ls and 3Ls, I think. If they want to be in the room where people decide on these very impactful statutes that give low-income people monthly payments on the 15th of the month, what should they be doing now or in the first years after law school?
Wow. Do you want to answer it or?
You don't have to watch.
Yeah.
City Philadelphia Law Department has a large tax unit that makes policy, helps draft legislation and regulations, litigates cases. So we offer during school internships as well as summer positions. And
That is Professor Francis Beckley, who is the head of the City Law Department. and who teaches the state and local tax boards here that you can take. But
Yeah, I think there are a lot of paths to it. I mean, there are internships early for law school. I think it's really tough because I don't think the internships for the US government, I don't think they pay these days, which, you know, it limits the audience, and that's really crappy. I do think that, I was talking to some folks earlier, there's jobs at IRS chief counsel that are available for immediate law school graduates. There are jobs at the Department of Justice. There are jobs, again, I'm talking about DC, that's what I'm familiar with. I know my wife runs a part of DOJ, and she just, in the honors program, hired a person from Temple Law who they love. This woman sounds awesome. So I know, and there's a lot of Temple alums in the tax world too. So I don't know. Don't take my path. It was roundabout and I was miserable for a long time. But I do think, you know, thinking about government service to the extent, you know, it works for your loans and everything else, it's a really great opportunity to get really meaningful work quickly. And you can stay, or you can take that experience and then go into the private sector. It's really valuable private sector experience. So,
and Professor Monroe, Professor Mandelbaum, me, Professor Bartow, we know and we have kept in touch with former students who are at the Office of Chief Counsel of the IRS in DC and in Philadelphia. So if you want to hear more, our doors are open, and we really love talking about tax. So take someone and join me in thanking Tom for coming.